I became obsessed with identifying paint chemical signatures. It ended up exposing the art forger who framed my mother. I spent 6 years learning to identify paint formulations by their chemical composition, and nobody understood why a 27-year-old woman would waste her time analyzing pigments under a microscope instead of doing something practical with her chemistry degree. My name is Victoria Hayes, and I'd been working as a lab technician at a pharmaceutical company since graduating from UC Berkeley. But every evening and weekend, I'd be in my apartment dissecting paint samples, running gas chromatography tests, and building databases of chemical signatures from different manufacturers and time periods. It started when I took an elective course on art conservation during my senior year and became fascinated by how you could date paintings through pigment analysis, how titanium white wasn't commercially available until 1921, how certain cadmium formulations could pinpoint a decade, how trace elements in lapis lazuli could identify the specific mine where the stone was ground into ultramarine blue. My professor thought I had potential for conservation work, but I didn't want to restore paintings. I wanted to understand them at the molecular level, to read their chemical stories the way other people read brushstrokes or composition. My boyfriend left me after 8 months because I'd rather spend Friday nights running spectroscopy tests than going to bars. And my mother kept suggesting gently that maybe I should focus on advancing my actual career instead of this expensive hobby that was taking over my tiny apartment with equipment I'd bought on credit. My father had died when I was 16, and my mother Elena had supported us through her work as a mid-level commercial artist, doing magazine illustrations and corporate commissions that paid bills but never quite fulfilled her artistic ambitions. She'd wanted to be a fine artist, had studied painting in Prague before immigrating to the States, but life and practical necessities had redirected her path, and I think she saw my obsession with paint chemistry as another example of chasing impractical passions instead of building stable foundations. The irony was that my mother understood artistic obsession better than anyone, even if she'd channeled hers into commercial work. She'd always encouraged my interest in science, had paid for my college education by working 60-hour weeks, and had never once suggested I should pursue something more traditionally feminine or less challenging. But this paint analysis hobby seemed different to her, seemed too niche and disconnected from marketable skills, and our weekly dinners had developed this uncomfortable pattern where she'd ask about my job and I'd give minimal answers before redirecting to whatever paint mystery I was currently investigating. The last normal conversation we'd had before everything fell apart was 3 weeks ago in November, when she'd shown me some new illustration work for a tech company's annual report, and I'd barely looked at it because I was excited about identifying a rare cobalt violet formulation in a sample from a supposedly 19th century landscape. She'd asked me directly whether I was happy, whether this obsession was fulfilling some need that I wasn't addressing in healthier ways, and I'd gotten defensive and said that just because she'd given up on her artistic dreams didn't mean I had to give up on understanding art at a deeper level. She'd looked hurt, and we'd finished dinner in awkward silence, and I'd left her house feeling guilty, but also frustrated that nobody seemed to understand why chemical signatures mattered. 3 weeks later, at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night, I got a phone call from my mother and immediately knew something catastrophic had happened from the way she was crying so hard she could barely speak. She managed to say that the FBI had raided her studio that afternoon, that they'd seized her paintings and her computers and her materials, and that she'd been formally accused of creating forged artworks that had been sold through several galleries for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The next morning, I drove to her house in Oakland, and that's when things took a turn I never expected. To see the full story, click the link below or go on my channel.